Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. What if instead of paying taxes at the gas pump every time you filled up your car, California just charged you a tax for every mile that you drive within a year? That is not yet law in California, but our state did take a step closer to that being our reality. That step is called AB 1421, and today we are unpacking what it is not, and why the conversation matters for you today. And buckle up because when it comes to implementing new taxes or talking about raising taxes, there is so much to say. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. Now, you may have heard in the news lately that there has been so much conversation, so many people talking about a potential mileage tax coming to California. So there's been a lot of discourse on what this even is, if it would replace the gas tax, pros and cons, all of that. And that is because there is a recent bill that was passed through the Assembly, and that is AB 1421. Now, this bill has not finalized in its process, it still has a ways to go, but it all centers around this idea of moving California to a vehicle miles traveled or VMT fee rather than or even in addition to the gas tax that's already in place. And before we even get into any of this, I just want to level set and clarify that this bill does not put a mileage tax in place. And so even if this passes all the way through to the governor's desk and is passed in our state, this would not implement a mileage tax. So we can all just take a big breath of relief. We can sigh of relief because that is not happening yet in our state. However, it is very important to understand any legislation that's going on, and especially something that has had so much time and research and conversation dedicated to it, which the mileage tax has. And so we need to fully understand what this bill does, what it does not do, and then what it would mean for our state if it continued the policy conversation around implementing a mileage tax. Basically, what AB 1421 does is it just extends the life of a committee whose sole purpose is to research and do pilot programs and look into how our state would be affected and how revenue would be affected for the government if we shifted to a mileage tax based system. And California has been researching this for over a decade at this point. And so, again, it doesn't implement a mileage tax. It just says that until 2035, that a group called the Road Usage Charge Technical Advisory Committee, because every committee or every group in California just has the longest name imaginable, but that group can continue its work for another decade. And really, this is kind of exciting to be looking at because this is where change starts. Usually, when we're talking about bills, when we're talking about policies, there are things that are already in the works, like a bill that's just about to be passed or coming to our governor's desk, or something that has already been passed that Gavin Newsom signed, and that we just have to look at what the repercussions will be. This is to talk about policy right in its formation. This is to talk about an idea that is still being researched, that is still having pilot programs run on it. And so today we get to form an opinion on that before it is even up as a bill through our legislature or on our ballots potentially for voting in a future election. But to fully be able to understand the pros and cons of changing the tax system, we need to take a step back and we need to understand each of the components that go into this. So let's start with the gas tax. What is the gas tax currently? What is it used for? And why are we looking to shift from it? You may have noticed that when you go fill up your car at the gas station, that you actually pay a tax. You pay a tax on gasoline. And that's because gasoline providers are actually taxed on gas that they provide to those gas stations. So the tax is actually at a different level. It's not at the consumer level. However, research has indicated that nearly all, if not just all of the tax is passed on to the consumer. And so that's why we think of the gas tax as being something that we feel because we pay for it. In 2026, it is currently 61.2 cents per gallon. So that means that if you go to the gas station today and you fill up your car with 14 gallons of gas, then you will be paying $8.57 just in California taxes. That does not include federal taxes and it does not include sales taxes, which are both also levied on gas. So that's not not really insignificant. And if that feels like a large amount to be paying just as a state tax on something that you're purchasing, that's because it is. California has the highest gas tax across the nation. And that's on top of the fact that California already has the highest average cost for a gallon of gasoline in our entire country. So we're just stacking them on top of each other, high taxes and high costs in general. So now you may be wondering, why have a gas tax? Why does our state need to tax the sale of gasoline? All revenue from the gas tax is supposed to go to transportation expenses. And this is often touted as going toward road maintenance, highway projects, just anything that needs to keep up the fact that when we have millions of drivers on the roads every day, that there is going to be wear and tear. There are going to be potholes. Certain places are going to explode in population, and suddenly you need to have more roads. You need to widen the roads. You need to add more lanes to the freeway, all of those sorts of projects. And it's actually in our state's constitution that the revenues from the gas tax has to go to these transportation related expenses. So they cannot be used just in the general fund for other expenses. It has to go specifically to what users, what the taxpayers are wanting to see improved, which would be if you as a taxpayer using the roads, you want to see them maintained. And this is not an insignificant amount of money for our state government because projections just for this current fiscal year, which will end in June, estimate that our government will have brought in $7.6 billion in revenue just from the gas tax alone. So clearly, this is a core revenue stream of our state government. And so they want to continue to find ways to keep that revenue coming in so that they can pay for all of these transportation expenses. So if the gas tax is so profitable and so relied upon, then why are we trying to move to a mileage-based tax system? Well, as we all know, in California over recent decades, we have tried to move toward a more climate-friendly agenda. And part of that has been trying to encourage drivers to drive electric vehicles rather than gas-powered cars. And so politicians and legislators are now citing the fact that they are expecting or anticipating that revenues from the gas tax are going to drop significantly because they say that as more and more people are buying electric vehicles and as our state moves toward a more electric vehicle model, then obviously people will be buying less and less gas, which means that they will be paying less and less in the gas tax. But the problem still stands that our government needs to be able to fund transportation projects and road maintenance. And so how are they going to do that if all of a sudden a majority of your drivers or just a larger share of your drivers are no longer paying into the system? And so the Legislative Analyst's Office, or LAO, projected back in 2023 that by 2033, so 10 years out, that the gas tax revenue would decline by 31%, which if this year it's projected to be a little over $7 billion, that's looking like a good $2 billion that our state has to prepare to be losing in revenue. And that in theory, it is saying it's not making up because EV drivers are not paying a similar tax. So it then makes sense that our state is panicking a little bit and trying to look into new ways to continue raising that revenue, to continue paying for increased spending on transportation costs. And the way that they're doing it is, as I've mentioned, a mileage-based tax. This type of tax does exactly what its name says. It would leverage a fee, a flat-based rate on every mile that you drove within a year. And so if we say that the mileage tax would be 3 cents, which is a fairly low and conservative estimate, but if we said that it was 3 cents per mile, if you drove 12,000 miles per year, which is a pretty average amount, then you would pay $360 annually. And so what politicians are using as their core premise in trying to push this type of tax system is that they are saying this is a fairer approach, that people who drive gas-powered cars shouldn't be on the hook to pay for all of the transportation costs that come up in our state, that people who drive electric vehicles are using the roads too. And so in order to have a more fair approach to being able to have people pay into the system, they're just going to put it on all drivers, regardless of the type of car you drive or regardless of what you're buying, whether you're using gas or electricity to power your car. And so this circles back to AB 1421 that I mentioned earlier, because California has actually been studying this type of tax system for over a decade. And in 2017, there was a pilot program that included more than 5,000 vehicles and 37 million miles reported. Basically, what they're trying to do with this type of research or a pilot pilot program is look into how feasible it would be to actually collect the miles that drivers are driving per year, and then how it would distribute actually applying different fees to different drivers, different car types, all of that. And what the original pilot program found was that while it was feasible to actually do it, you could make it work, there were a lot of issues that they hadn't seen coming. And so these were things like fairness, even in the fees that are distributed among vehicles, in protecting privacy in reporting, in different pros and cons of reporting methods like manually reporting to the government versus electronically reporting, different options like that. And so, because there were so many problems, the work just continued. And legislation has continued to extend this committee's research year over year over year. And so it has again come until now. And AB 1421 is just the next piece in that puzzle because it is just extending this work out again another decade. And so today, there is not a mileage tax. But the research is continuing the policy conversation around implementing a mileage tax, and it could be laying the groundwork for potentially introducing legislation that would place a mileage tax in California. So that is where we're at today with this entire process. So, although there's not a mileage tax in place today, it is very important that we understand what the implications of this would be for people who live here in California, that we think through the issues, we think through the pros, we think through if this is a fairer approach so that we can make an informed decision on whether or not we would support or oppose this type of legislation if we saw our government continue to move down this path, which it seems likely that it will. And when I was thinking about this, I just had so many thoughts. It felt hard to contain them all, but I have boiled them down into three major problems that I see with moving toward a mileage-based tax. The first problem is really more of the practical questions that I started to mention that they started to see in their pilot program. And so, if we are actually going to think about moving to an entirely new tax-based system that's a mileage tax over a gas tax, there are just a lot of practicalities that become very difficult and start to make us realize that the system isn't quite as fair as politicians are trying to paint it out to be. So, really, the first issue in this category is the reporting issue. And so, if you think about it, how are we going to collect from drivers accurately how many miles that they drove per year? If it is a manual process, if it's the drivers actually reporting to the government, similar to in a tax return of how many miles you drove, that starts to raise questions around potential fraud. Do you really think that people are going to be honest about the number of miles that they drove if they know it will just charge them a higher amount in taxes? Because I personally do not think that. And so then the government has to think through how it's going to have anti-fraud measures, what will be in place, how it's going to investigate if miles are accurate that people are reporting. That's going to take more manpower. That's going to take more processes set in place, which inevitably is going to require more money because it's people carrying out those processes. So manual just seems like it doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems like it would be very difficult to collect from people and just seems like it would be a place that is ripe for fraud. But then on the other hand, if you start to think through an electronic reporting system, that's where we start to get into privacy concerns. Because if the government mandates that every car have some sort of tracker, then people get very uncomfortable with that. We don't like to think that the government is tracking our every move. And even if they say that it's not a GPS, would we believe them? Like, if the government is capable of actually implementing either a software or hardware that is going to track how many miles you are driving, then will it also be tracking the location? Will it infringe on some of those privacy rights? So conservatives are already raising the alarm or red flag about that process. And so you're really just left with this question of how are we going to do this accurately? How are we going to make sure that everyone is fairly reporting the miles that they drive? Because if I'm going to be honest about the miles I'm driving and pay a high tax, I don't want to know that there are millions of people who are just lying about the miles that they are driving so that they can pay lower tax. That starts to get more into those fairness questions once again. And then outside of that question, there's also questions with the rates. Because even though the gas tax may seem imperfect, or again, it's painted not as the most fair approach, it does take into consideration the fact that some cars are gas guzzlers. Some things are commercial trucks and they just take more gas. And with that, because they're often heavier vehicles, they are the ones that incur more wear and tear on the highways. And so the question is, should a big rig or should, again, a gas guzzler truck be paying the same just flat mileage mileage rate that a Prius is paying every time that it's on the road? Shouldn't EVs be given some sort of special treatment if our government is truly saying that they are more eco-friendly and that they're trying to push every driver into driving them? So it starts to just get messy. Are we going to have different rates in every different tier? Every time you buy a car, do you have to think about your mileage rate? A lot of questions about rate fairness. And then there's also the consideration that do rural commuters have to pay more into the system simply because they live further? Some places in California, you're not living in the city. You're not going to live right in the heart of Los Angeles. You're not going to live just a walk away from your job. And so if you live out on a farm, you're going to be driving a lot further. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're putting more wear and tear on the streets, or it doesn't even mean that transportation projects are going to directly benefit you. And so, are we just going to punish everyone who lives further distances out from places where grocery stores are, out from where their jobs are, things like that? So, the bottom line is that when you start to get into these practicalities of how a system would be implemented, you really see it's not as straightforward. It's not as fair as politicians are making it out to be. There is going to be some inequality in the process. And so, we have to start to think, are those inequalities truly better than the system that we currently have in place? Are they worth changing the entire system across our state, shaking up the way that things are done? And is it worth the risk of some of the cons that we see in place, such as those more fraudulent measures that could be happening by moving from a gas tax, which is just when you buy gas and is pretty hard to get out of, versus having to now report your mileage? Just a lot of questions that make it seem like, is this really worth it? But the practical questions are not the only problem, because if we take a step back and we look at the bigger picture as a whole, there's actually a greater question that underlies both the gas tax and the mileage-based tax. And that question is this revenue even necessary? Is it really even needed by our government in the first place? Or do we see signs of mismanagement that should make us wary about the fact of either changing the tax system or leveraging an entirely new tax on us who live here in California? And so really this comes up because you notice that our legislators are not talking about cutting spending. They're not looking at future projections and saying, well, people are moving to EVs because that's what we have told them and incentivized them to do. And so now we're going to make less in the gas tax revenue. And so how can we cut spending so that we don't have to continue to leverage taxes or raise taxes on the people who live in our state? That's not even a consideration. The immediate jump is, what new tax can we put in place? How can we make sure that everyone is paying us more and more money? And I just think that's a bad premise to start with. I don't think that we should start out with the assumption that the solution to all of your spending problems are just raising more money from the taxpayer. And when you think deeply about this, it just gets more frustrating when you remember that California takes so much in taxes. Outside of the gas tax, just all types of taxes, California makes so much revenue off of the people who live under its care. In 2025, California had the fourth highest overall tax burden at a whopping 11% on its own people. And that only comes behind three other states, Vermont, New York, and Hawaii, which again, arguably are just some of the most expensive states to live in. So that's just wonderful. But what's interesting is that in most recent budget forecasts, California is showing that its tax revenue, again, of all types, is far above its expectations. We have had record growth in the revenues that we're bringing in. And so again, the LAO was reporting that for the budget outlook of this year, that revenue is growing by 4% year over year, which is at a bit of a historical high. However, the problem is that spending is growing at 5.8% year over year. So our spending is well overblowing the revenue that we're bringing in. And so even though we're bringing in higher and higher amounts of money from you and from me, our government is taking that money and they're spending way more than what they have, which leads them into this conundrum that says we need more money from the taxpayer. And so it's frustrating to think that even as we are continuing to see growth in revenue, that our government is continuing to anticipate deficits. We're still talking about the fact that we're going to be in budget deficits. And the issue, again, is not the money because they're bringing in the money. But do you ever see our politicians or our governor or our legislators talking about how we're going to cut the spending because we're already bleeding people dry here in California? No, they don't talk about that. They just want to think, what new tax can we implement today? That's a problem. And this is important. This is very important for us to understand in California. If we are going to live in a state with a very high tax burden, then we need to talk about the purpose of taxes, because taxes should be literally as low as humanly possible. Taxes are a necessary evil that we all understand are a very important part of trying to run and maintain a government, but taxes are not an opportunity for your government to take advantage of you. They're not an opportunity for your government to take more than what it needs from you. And this goes back to the very founding of our country. Our founding fathers knew that the government can be corrupted and that government is greedy. And that's because human beings are greedy for power. And so when you get any of it, it just can spiral into taking more and more of it. And taxes are a primary example of government power and government overreach spiraling out of control. Because if the government says, we need this much money from you, and then year over year, they just keep increasing it and growing it again and again, then the government is just taking more and more money. But the burden of proof is not on the taxpayer. It's not on us to say why we shouldn't be having to give you more and more of our income. The burden of proof should be on the government to show why it is necessary. And if it is not necessary, then they should not be allowed to raise taxes, and we should not be comfortable to let them. Taxation requires justification because taxation is theft. It is a form of taking money. Now, again, we all understand that we can't just not pay any money into the government because we want certain services. We need a government to function. But government should only take the money that it needs to do the bare minimum, to actually perform legitimate services that every taxpayer is benefiting from. It should not continue to take more and more money because it is just expanding programs to now interfere in every area of your life or to manage every area of other people's lives in your state. Once it starts to do that, we need to rein it back in and say, no, you have enough. You have been given billions of dollars. You need to figure out how to make that work, not continue to think, I just need a couple billion more. Now, California has clearly not met that standard at all because spending is just going up and up. But again, we just need to increase the money that we're bringing in. And the most prominent example or the clearest data that is showing us California has not adhered to this principle of our very country when it comes to taxation is the fact that in the 7 budgets that Gavin Newsom has signed during his tenure as governor, spending has increased by 72%. Spending and expenses have gone up by 72% just in 7 budgets. That's insane. That has nearly doubled our spending over the course of just 7 cycles. And so we've gone from $203 billion budget, which is what it was when he started, to now a $349 billion budget. Are you telling me that 72% of an increase was completely necessary just to cover the bare essentials that government provides? If you're telling me that, I do not believe you. I do not believe you. And this applies directly to transportation costs. Because if you think that these transportation expenses covered by the gas tax are just road maintenance, if you just think that it's those potholes that you see and that you are thankful that someone comes and fills in, then you need to think again. Because transportation expenses are a fertile ground for all types of mismanagement of money. And so in 2019, 20% of gas tax revenues from a newly passed Senate bill at the time were set aside for railways and mass transit. And then there was another 100 million set aside for bike paths and walking paths. Now, none of these things are bad. I love walking trails. I love bike paths. I think that they are great. But is that what the purpose of the gas tax is for? Is that what the narrative that is sold to taxpayers is actually saying? No, because our government is spending millions, if not billions of dollars on initiatives that have nothing to do with transportation. And so even if there are good initiatives, even if there are things that sound lovely, I would love new walking paths to be set up. When it comes to a problem of overspending, you have to start to think of what is necessary. What programs can we cut this year because we don't have the funds for it? And if we have a stronger year where we have less expenses in other areas or we have higher revenue, then maybe we can have an initiative to put some new bike paths in. And so are these initiatives actually necessary for people to be able to drive on the streets? No. They're not. And so California needs to get its spending under control. If you start to feel in your personal budget like you don't have enough money for all the things that you want to buy, what you have to do is evaluate what things you are buying and then say, what things do I need? I need food. I need to make sure that my clothes are in good enough condition for me to wear. And I need to make sure that my just basic essentials, my rent, anything else like that, electricity, is covered for the month. But I can cut out spending on things that are fun. They are good. They are great things for me to do, but I don't have the money for them this month. That is what our government needs to be doing. They don't have the money for things that are not bare necessities. And it's important to remember that government is not here to give you everything that you want. Even if a bike path sounds really nice, it is not up to the government to continue just putting more programs and more programs and more projects in place that are not essentials, because we can work with private companies, the private sector, we can work with nonprofits, we can work with other resources in order to set up programs and projects that will do just that. But the government shouldn't now demand that you pay a higher tax or an entirely different tax simply because it has dreams of what it wants to give you. The government is not here to fulfill your dreams. It is to make sure that you have just the basic requirements of what you need to live and then give you the freedom to build off of those. And so just as another more infuriating example, again in 2019, Governor Newsom directed California to use transportation dollars to, quote, help reverse the trend of increased fuel consumption and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Why are we doing that? Why is that the goal of our governor in transportation costs, is now use the money from the gas tax to figure out ways to get people to drive less? And so in response, Caltrans actually delayed funding for several highway projects, which are actually the purpose of the funds from the gas tax, and instead redirected $61 million into priority rail projects instead. And so again, you just have to ask, is this necessary? Is this how they should be spending your dollars and my dollars? Shouldn't they be expanding the highways first and foremost with that revenue, because that will directly benefit the person who is driving on the roads, rather than expanding rail projects, which should be a secondary priority? And we should not be using taxpayer funds to fund your pet climate project. That's just insane. So it is clear to see this is not just an issue of, well, we need road maintenance and every driver needs to pay into road maintenance. It's not like that. California's wasting your money. As usual, with every single area of life, they are wasting your money. And so no, we are not going to give them more money in taxes. We're not going to raise the taxes. We should abolish the gas tax. They don't need those funds. They are mishandling them. They have lost their privileges to have them. But none of those arguments, none of those reasons actually cover the heart of the issue, which is that the very idea that we need to move to a mileage tax system is based on essentially a house of cards. So just as a reminder, they're doing this because they're saying that EVs are increasing so much in California that revenues from the gas tax are going to drop significantly. And so they won't have money for these pet transportation projects. That's a lie. None of that has actually panned out. That's all based on projections and outlooks that were originally put in place because of California's mandate that said that they were going to ban the sale of gas-powered cars or new gas-powered cars by 2035. The problem is the United States Senate last spring struck that down. They said that that was entirely unenforceable. And so that initiative is basically dead. California cannot enforce that. But even on top of that, before that was struck down, we saw that there was no way we were going to make that goal because the sale of EVs has actually slowed. And so by the end of last year, more than 80% of new cars sold just in Q4 were still gasoline or hybrid. So that is in no way the explosion toward 100% electric vehicles that we were promised. California's EV share of sales dropped from 25.3% in 2024 to 22.9% last year. And so we're seeing that EV sales are actually decreasing year over year. And so the argument that we are going to lose just astronomical amounts of money in gas tax revenues has not been proven out. Again, it's all on these projections that at this point are outdated and that have not been proven by any data. We have not seen a decline in the revenue that we're bringing in from the gas tax, and we've not seen an explosion in EVs here in California. And so until we see those things pan out, until we see the realities of, oh my gosh, everybody's buying an EV and driving an EV beyond just the initial explosion that we saw happen at the very beginning of EVs rolling out, until that actually happens, we don't need to change the tax system. We don't need a mileage tax. We don't need to change the whole structure or increase taxes. Nothing has dropped. So they are anticipating a drop that hasn't happened because they are seeing an increase in spending that has happened. No words for that. And just as a point on the fairness, because going back to the entire premise is that isn't it more fair for every driver to pay into the system? If every person on the road needs transportation maintenance to some extent, even if it's overblown by California, then why should only people who drive gas-powered cars actually pay into it? If that's the whole premise, then that is also untrue because EV owners in California pay a special annual road improvement fee during car registration year over year, and they do that to compensate for the fact that they don't pay the gas tax. So what are we even doing here? Like, your whole argument is, well, EV drivers don't pay the gas tax and they should have to pay into the system. They already do. They already pay on average $153 to more dollars per year. And that increases year over year, depending on the car that you drive, just to compensate for the fact that you're not paying the gas tax. So again, remind me of why we even need to do this, because suddenly all of your reasons have disappeared. Now, all of that was a lot of information. So let's just zoom out. Let's take a step back for a second and wrap up of why we should care about this today. Because even though it is not in place today, I argue that we should care about it. And the reason is that, again, as I mentioned before, policy shifts don't happen overnight. They happen with things like this, with research, with groups, with committees, with legislators looking into it and spinning up a narrative around it. And we see that with the mileage tax, a narrative has been spun. We have been told it's not fair. We have been told every driver needs to pay into it. We've been told these cover basic transportation expenses. But the more that we look into it, the more that we see this is not true. And so what we need to do is we need to be informed on if what our government, if what our politicians, if what our legislature is telling us is actually true and is the case. And in this case, we see that it is not. And so we need to fight back against that. We need to push back against that to actually change and inform how the public sees this issue so that when someone says, well, but it's more fair, everyone should pay into it, you are armed and ready to say, everyone already does. Everyone already does. There's already fees. Actually, California still continues to make billions of dollars off of the gas tax year over year, and they have just proven that they mishandled that money. So that you are armed with the facts so that we can stop this in its tracks before it becomes a potential bill, before it is being put in front of our governor, before it is on a ballot for us to vote on. And of course, we are also trying to push forward principles that we know to be good and true, and that we know are rooted in this truth that we are seeking. Principles like limited government. We want to limit our government's power, and that includes limiting its ability to just raise taxes into oblivion on us. Less waste. We know that our government is just wasting money, and that is wrong. That is wrong. It is deeply disrespectful to taxpayers to waste their money on initiatives that they do not approve of or that they don't even know are going on, and that go directly against the core principles that you promised you were spending their money on. That's wrong, and we should root out all government waste. And we should demand then more efficient spending. The government should only be spending your money insofar as it makes your life better and creates the very system that we all live and operate in as a democratic society. If it is not doing that, then it is not doing it correctly, and we must hold our leaders accountable. This moment is important now because this is where we lay the groundwork for people to actually understand what is going on, to be informed, and to stop the deception that is going on around us before it really even starts. AB 1421 may just have extended a study, but studies become policies. Policies affect people, and that is precisely why paying attention now matters. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you even learned something new. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.